In this next module, let's use some services with Angular. We're going to start by creating a service, show you how to make calls to APIs, introduce you to type safety in Angular and the importance of that, show you how to share data across those components, and use calculated data. Let's get started. Let's start by creating a new service. Back in Visual Studio, let's go back to the terminal and make sure we're compiling it by just running the ng build watch command. You may already have this running, and if so, just leave it running. I want to make sure you are still building the project. And then we can open up that source directory, come down to the source app folder, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder called services. And I'm going to create a service I'm going to call the store. And I'm going to use service in the name and then just TS. This follows the pattern we've seen with the other file names that many projects use. And in our case, all we're going to do is export a new class, which we'll call the store. What we want the store to actually have is the data that represents the different items in our store. And so let's go down to our product list view. We're going to take this list of products out of this product list view so that we can share it among different pieces, that we're going to create a service that represents the products in a store. So store.products will now be that list of products. Eventually we'll call an API, but first things first. Now we can go back to the product list view and create a constructor here. And in this case, we can say that we want a store of type store. So we want to inject this type into our product list view. And let's go ahead and bring that in, and what it's going to find it in the services store, of course. And in that way, we can just assign the products from the store.products, right? We can just take that list of products we've defined and assign them here in the store. And then we can just say a public member called products, and we're going to assign it just an empty array for now. And when we inject this store into it, this service, we're going to be able to use that products, or we could even bind directly to the store without having to keep a member. We're going to see both in our examples, but this will be good enough to get us started. Now, how does it know to shove this in the store? The trick here is in the service, we need to tell it that it's injectable, and we can do that with a decorator. So if I say injectable, we can see that it wants to help us import injectable from Angular core. And if we've done everything right, our project should still work. Let's give it a try. So we'll go to the store page, we'll log in. And now we can see this isn't working. Let's see if we can figure out why. If we go to the tooling, we'll see that there's an error that says no provider for store. It wants to inject that store into product list view for us, but we haven't told it that we can provide it. And the trick here is to actually go to our app module, and we need to add it here in providers. We'll go ahead and import the store from the same service, and we're effectively saying we want to provide store to other components. And this is an important idea here because this is the essence of dependency injection in Angular. You're going to have different services or other different types that you want to provide. And by wiring them up here, go ahead and save this so it updates our project. We come back to show the page, and we can see it now works, right? We can see the data that's inside the store that we're injecting into the view. The importance here is not that we have now created one more level of indirection. The important part here is in our store, we're going to actually get this data from some API and have the business logic around that in the central place, that not only can we inject it here at the product list view, but we might need it in other places. Let's start working with the API next. Now let's call an API. Back in Visual Studio, let's go back to that app module, because just like we provided store to be injected, we're also going to need to provide some other elements to allow us to use them in our store. Specifically, we want to use the HTTP client stack to make API calls. And so what we want to do here is actually in imports, is we want to import a module called HTTP client module. And this comes from import HTTP client module. And that comes from @Angular common HTTP. This is a module that contains a number of classes that we want to be able to import into our classes. Now, provider is for these one-offs, these single classes we want to provide, but modules are a way to collect a number of different classes that want to be supporting injection. And so that's why some of the Angular pieces are actually bundled up in these imports. We're going to see a couple more imports as we continue on in the course. So you can see that some of those are bundled up. Third parties would probably be bundled up in the same way. And for us, this is our module where we're bundling those up, right? We're providing store from our own module. Now that we have that, we can go over to the store and let's create a constructor. We're going to make a private member called HTTP, and we're going to use the type of HTTP client. This is the actual class that can do requests across the server. And you can see this is from that same place that the module is coming from. And because we said private HTTP, we don't need to make a member for it. But for us, we're going to get rid of the sample data because we're going to get it from an API, right? So how are we going to actually load this data? We're going to create a function of our class, which I'll call load products. And this will start the operation to actually load products. And here we're going to use that HTTP object to get some data, right? And because we're sitting on our same server, I can just use a relative URL to our API, which if you remember is products. We built that earlier. What we actually end up doing is returning this. We're returning this so that whoever calls this can start the asynchronous process for us. Well, we're not quite done because this is going to send back the object with all the response types and raw data back to whoever calls it. So we're actually going to call pipe. And pipe says, after you get this, I want to run a little code before you return it back. And a big part of what makes Angular work is this idea of using RxJS or reactive extensions to be able to handle some of these operations. And for us, we actually want to use an operation called map. Map is from RxJS. So we're going to bring in map, and we're going to bring it from RxJS, which was brought in by our Angular automatically because they're tied to work together pretty easily. And we're going to get this from operators. What does map do? It basically takes the result of this operation, allows us to change it into a form that is very easily used by the views, which is, in our case, is going to be just an object graph. Because what we're getting back from the HTTP call is just a string of JSON. And so we need to do that operation to turn it into objects. And we do this by providing a lambda or an arrow function to the map. And that map is going to be passed in the data, and then we need to do something with it. And in our case, our mapping is pretty simple. We're just going to say this.products. So instead of returning the products, we're actually just going to apply them to the data, and then we're just going to return. Now here's a point where TypeScript is going to say, hey, I don't know that this data is the right type, right? It thinks data is just some arbitrary object, and our product is expecting an array of something, right? Our products have been implicitly typed with that array type. And so what we want to actually do is say, you know what, this data is of a certain type. We're expecting products to return us an array of something. And so we can actually use templates here to tell it what is the type that it returns. So here I'm saying, hey, products returns an array. Therefore, this map becomes an array. Therefore, we can then assign this to the products, which is also an array. Later, we'll use this for actual type safety. But for now, we're just going to use that array. Or we could have changed the type here and left this without the get. But this is the easiest way to tell the get what we expect it to return. So how do we actually make this work? We come back here into products, and we're going to implement essentially an interface, and that is on a init. This is an interface that Angular supports to say, call this once everything's been initialized. And you can see it saying, should I add a init because it's just existing in Angular core? I'm going to say yes. And then it's going to complain because we haven't actually implemented it. If you've done a bunch of C#, this should be really familiar because we're saying this implements this interface for on a init and we need to actually have the methods or properties that map to that. So when I say implement it, what does it do? It just creates the method for onInit. onInit just has a call called ng-onInit, doesn't return anything, so that this method can actually do something. This is just saying that once the product view has been loaded, run some code. And so what we're going to do here is actually say this store load products. If we just call load products, this isn't actually going to call the load products to be executed, because all we're going to get back here from load products is actually this thing called an observable. And notice it says observable void because it doesn't know about the type of data that's been returning to it. But observable is a type in reactive extensions, defines an object that can let you know when something happens, usually when data changes. So what we actually need to do here is call subscribe. Subscribe would allow us to have callbacks for success and error if we need that. But in this case, we're just going to fire and forget. We're going to implement this with success and error handling a little later. But just to begin with, just realize that this subscribe kicks off the operation. All we've done in the service is say, hey, we want to make this call. This is some code that goes along with it. And when we return it from load products, what we're going to get is just an object that we then need to call subscribe to start the operation. We're going to make one small change in the way we're binding. We're going to use the store as the central point of truth for our data. So we don't need to store the products separately here or assign them here. What we're going to do instead is open up that product list HTML. We're just going to make one small change here, and that is to say store.products. And now because we want to use the store here, we go back to our product list. We're not going to be able to use private here. We're going to actually have to make this public so that the binding can actually use it. So now that this is a public version of store, our component can use it here. Now, when we run it, it calls that service and then spits all of the data from the API. We can see that. We look in the console, make sure that XHRs are shown, and we can actually see the get out to the products and that this returned in the response these actual objects from the server that we're going to use to go ahead and show on the page, right? So now that we can call an API, let's start using this to actually display our products, not just make a list of them. Let's do that next. Now that we're calling the API, we want to really use the power of TypeScript by introducing some type safety. Back in Visual Studio, we have this list of products. Let's take a look at it in the service. And it's just an array, right? There's no type information to confirm that it's the actual types we want. But of course, it doesn't know what a product looks like, so we're going to need to define that. Let's go ahead and inside app, let's create a new folder called shared. And I'm just going to create a capital P product.ts. This will be a class that represents our product with types and names of each of the properties. So how do we do this? I could go look at all the property names and type them in here by hand, but there's actually a shortcut. Back here in the browser, I'm going to open up a new window and just go localhost API products, right? This is our API and having it return some raw data. I'm going to go to the raw data itself, and we can see it's kind of complicated, and I'm just going to copy it all because I want to take this to a website called json2ts.com, right? And this is a website, json2ts.com, that will allow you to enter some JSON and generate the TypeScript for it. So you can see what it's done here is it's declared a module for us, which we're not using. And it's declared an interface. Now we could copy this whole interface, but I'm actually just going to grab all of the members of it and plop it in our new class. We can see here that it's taken the types that we defined and inferred the type that it thinks it should be. And so we have numbers and strings and dates, etc. It might be Booleans and some of these others. And so by using the product type, we're not going to allow people to assign a number to a size, a string to the price, etc. We're going to deal with the actual types. How do we use this type now that we have it? So you would think, like in C# that you would just add product here before the array, but that's not where the type information is. Remember, this is assigning data. What we actually need to do here is put in a colon for this optional type information. And so there we can say product array. And let's bring in that product type from shared product. And then this products is now typed as an array of these product objects. And so we're going to want this load products to actually return something. And it's inferred that we're returning an observable of void. What does that mean? Well, because we're returning nothing here, it assumes that the return of this is actually going to be a wrapper of observable around whatever that is. We could have put true here, and it would have inferred to us that it is an observable Boolean. But let's leave it without a return type, and let's explicitly tell it that we want this to be an observable of void, right? That we're not actually returning anything. And let's bring that observable in from args.js. And the power here is that when we use this in our component, that we know what this is actually doing, right? That the subscribe, if we were to add a method here, it would assume that what it was returning was nothing. If we tried to give it a value here, it should complain because the type that's being returned back through the subscribe isn't a value of any sort. It's a void. Or more importantly, this would be typed if we were actually returning something like a Boolean or even a collection. We don't actually need to do anything in the subscribe because, of course, we're just relying on the binding of the store. But this should give you a good idea of introducing the type safety to understand really what it's doing. So on the face of it, type safety feels like it's just increasing or helping you get better IntelliSense, but it's also checking that compilation. In a project this small, type safety may not feel that important, but as you scale up into larger and larger projects, having that compilation time, checking your code, checking to make sure that assumptions you've made haven't been broken is going to be important long term, just like it is for C# code. So next, let's use this type safety to go ahead and build the actual product page for us. Let's go ahead and implement that template in the client side instead of the server side. Back in Visual Studio again, let's actually go down to our views, because if you remember, on our shop page, we had this view of what an individual item on the page should look like. We can go ahead and implement this in our code as well. So I'm going to copy this and go over to our template here, right? We have the unordered list going through the products, but instead of just concatenating some strings here, let's go ahead and paste that same code that we were using. Because remember, originally we were using the server-side code to go through each of those products. Now we're doing the same thing on the client side once we've gotten the products through the API. So we can use a lot of that same code. Of course, unordered list and list item isn't what we want anymore, so let's go ahead and say div and div to fix those up. And in fact, we can get rid of this level div and merge this level div. Let's take that core of 3, because this div is actually going to be repeated as well. And we'll clean that up by just getting rid of 2 of the divs. So we really have a row and then a number of these column 3s to show on the page. But remember, this is the template. So we have this P here. We want to convert all of this server-side code into Angular code. So let's start with just the simple category and size. Instead of that @ symbol that Razor uses, we're going to use, unsurprisingly, double curly braces. And because the API has camel-cased the property names, we're going to need to lowercase them as well. So let's do the same thing here, get rid of the @ and change the case. And we can do that pretty easily for most of these, right? And so we've got a good start here. What about the image source here, right? We have a couple of bindings here we'd like to get fixed. And the first thing we're going to want to do here is just change this in that same way. We can actually use the curly braces inside of the markup to do the same thing. Just because they're in quotes doesn't mean it won't work. It'll see it and do the right thing. Let's see if this is working. If we refresh our page, we can now see we're getting a lot of what we expected to get, right? These are the different views, but of course we can see that the image is missing. Let's go back, and probably it's because we didn't change the case here, right? So anytime you have missing data, make sure you're mapping that same thing. Now you might think, why doesn't the type safety work here? The templates themselves don't know about those types, so there's no way to sort of infer this here. There are some editors that try to figure out and help you with that with IntelliSense, but you're not going to see it in Visual Studio. And in fact, I noticed one more that I missed down here, and that's the description. And so we go back over and refresh. We can see that it's showing that image tag, but of course the images aren't working. And why is that? We go ahead and look at the image location. Let's go ahead and put that in another tab. We can see here that it has that tilde in it. That tilde to say the root of the project doesn't work in Angular because it's not Razor. We have to come back here and get rid of that tilde and just assume that it's going to be the root of our project. Go ahead and refresh our page. And we're starting to see something similar to what we actually wanted, right? Still seems a little long and hard to navigate, but this is at least a good starting point. One of the other things we can do here is actually style just for the pieces we're looking at. So let's come back over here and let's go to our product list. And we're going to add another property here called style URLs. This is going to allow you to point at one or more files that have the CSS or the styling that is scoped just to this part of the product. And so we're going to put that in a file called product list view.component, big surprise here, .css, right? So let's go ahead and create that file. Product list view.component.css, right? What we're going to want to do is first, let's style that image so it is consistent. So I'm going to create a class for product image. I'm going to create a border and a shadow and a little bit of a margin. And if we go back to the HTML, the markup, let's just make sure that we have not only image fluid, but product image, right? That we're saying that this CSS is going to be useful on this particular page. It's going to be scoped to it. So if we refresh the page, we can see we're now getting that shadow and a border, and it's making it look a little better, but we're not quite done because these product props are just way too big. We're going to create a new class. We're going to call it products props. We're using that name because in our view, we actually have this unordered list that already has this products props name. What are we going to do here? We're just going to set the font size to 0.9 rem, just so it's a bit smaller than the rest of the page. We come back and view this, we're going to see that this has become just a little smaller, but the lists are still really big, and we could style these, but instead, let's come back here and change this from an H3 to an H4, just to make it a little smaller. And now that we have that, let's make a couple of other small changes. I think the category and size are a bit big, so I'm going to make those H5 just to make them much smaller. I'm also going to take off the description here from the art description because it's already pretty long. And lastly, I'm going to change this from 3 to 4 because it feels awfully condensed on our page. I want to give it a little bit more room. Remember, going from column 3, which means 4 across, we're going to go to column 4, which is 3 across, because that number is 12 divided by that number to see how many we're getting across. We come back here, we're starting to see that this is looking just a little better. They're still a little long, but I think it's good enough because this description I think is important. One of the things I don't really love here is that the price is injecting that $, because we actually did that, right? We said, oh, this is the $. What we're going to use instead are something called pipes. And so pipe gets its name from using the pipe character and then a list of different ways to format the data. This is essentially passing it through a small amount of code to spit it out. And for us, we can use one called currency. There's a number of these that are built in for doing certain things like date functions, currency functions, etc. And by just changing this without putting that $, there, we can see it still looks like it has that $. And if we add the currency code, like GPB for the British pound or the Great Britain pound, we can see it now shows the pound symbol. By default, it's going to get the currency from the current locale. So if you're dealing with an example that's just here in the US where I live, or just in your country, you may see the currency symbol show up as a different type. But by looking at the pipes in the documentation, you'll see some of the other ones that may be useful. So next, let's create that cart component that we're going to show next to the product list views so we can see how they can work together. So let's create that cart component to work with our product list view. Back in Visual Studio, I'm going to go ahead and close all these tabs just for now. We're going to create a new view. So in that view folder, I'm just going to create a cart view.component.ts. And so like we did before, we're going to export a class called cart view. And we're going to create that component decorator, which we can go ahead and import for us so that we can do the same things we've done before. We're going to give it a selector, and unsurprisingly, we'll call this cart. Then we'll have a template URL for our cart view.component.html, which we'll create in a moment. We'll even go ahead and add the style URLs. And we'll leave it as an empty collection for now. We may need to add it later, but that'll be good enough. And let's go ahead and create a constructor. And this constructor, just like before, we're going to create a public store of type store. And let's go ahead and have Visual Studio help us bring the import in. And that's all we need. We have this new component, but we need to take this new component, and we're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to create a cart view.component.html. To get rid of all that HTML, just go ahead and put in cart. And let's put an HR in there just so we can see that it's actually different from what we saw before. So we have our component defined, even though there's no real logic to it yet. And let's go back down to the module, because just like we had to do for the list view, we're going to need to add our cart view here as well. We'll go ahead and have it import it for us. And this way, when the cart view is imported, we'll be able to use it. And where are we going to use it? We're going to go back to the app component.html. Remember, we used to have cart as just an H3 here, just like we had a product list here. Let's go ahead and just insert here our new component, right? We're just specifying it here in our design because we said that was the selector. Go back to the browser and refresh. We can see this is now our cart component, right? Has the underscore. So we know that is actually the component being listed here. So this is one component and this is another. And then we have some code behind it that's actually communicating between them, right? They both have references to that same shop object in case they want to share data. So now that we have the cart defined, let's go ahead and use the store to share some data next. So let's talk about how we can share data across those components. Back in Visual Studio, we're going to want to have this cart show items as we've ordered them. And so we're going to actually need to store these things as order items, because eventually we're going to post them up to the server, right, to add a new order in. To get these classes, remember, order is secured. So let's go ahead and open Postman. You may still have this saved in your Postman. If not, you're going to want to go to account create token and post to that account create token URL with the username and password, because we're going to need this token just like we used in the prior module in order to go ahead and call API orders, right? We're going to need to add that authorization. And with the authorization header set, we should be able to get the current orders in their system. And for us, we really only have one order and one order item, which is plenty. So I'm going to take this whole section of the order with its one order item, and I'm going to go back to JSON to ts.com and put that in, generate the TypeScript, so that I have two pieces, right? I have the order item interface and the interface for that root object. I'm going to copy both of these and put them in a new file. Remember, we had the shared folder, so I'm going to create an order.ts. And I'm going to paste these in here. Now, I'm going to export these separately, and I'm going to export them as classes instead and just name them the same that I'm used to, order item. And because it didn't know the name, it just chose root object, but I'm going to make this an order. And we'll need to change this type to order item array. And it should like both of these. And the reason we're doing this is so that we can then use this type in order to store our data in the cart. Only other thing we could do is actually give these some default values if we had them. And there are a couple of values here that might be interesting. The first one could be that we can go ahead and assign this an array. Of course, we need to make the order a class just like we did the other one, so that items is a valid array, not just typed to that. We can also say new date here to get the current date as a value. Now that we have both classes, let's come back to the store. We're going to export another public property called order. And what is this going to be? This is going to be an order that we'll go ahead and pull in from order. And we're going to just create it as a new order item. So we always have an existing order just sitting there. And we're not loading this from the server. We're not doing any of that. We're just creating an empty order that we can add stuff to. But we're not going to end there. We're going to actually also create a new method called add to order. And this is going to accept in it a product of typed product. So we're going to allow them to add a product to our order. And so how do we do that? We're going to say this.order.items.push new item, right? And here we're going to have to create our constant new item equals new order item. We're going to bring that in as another import. And we could just add it then, but we're going to need to take this product information and set it here. So our new item is going to have a product ID of what? Product.id, right? We're just going to do this for each one. Product title equals product.title. Artist ID equals product.art. Let's move this to the top, and I'll just quickly do the rest of these. For quantity, I'm just going to set it at 1 for now. We're not going to worry about multiple objects yet. We'll just start with new products. So we have all the product information set, the unit price, the quantity, and then what are we going to do? We're just going to push it into our new item, right? And so every time this gets called, we're going to add a new item. And so let's go over to our cart. Let's just create a quick div that just says count equals store. Remember, we have the store there. Dot order dot items dot length, right? Because it's order dot items and we're pushing it in, this should change every time we add a new item into our cart. Last thing we need to do is actually call that service. So let's go back into our product list. And remember, we had this buy button. So on our button, what are we going to do? We're going to actually create an event handler for click, which, if you remember, we're going to use the parentheses here to say we want to handle some event, and that event on our button, of course, is going to be click. And what are we going to do here? We could call down to a product list function or member, or we can just actually use store add to order and pass in that P. Now, what is that P? That P is the individual product here. And so this is going to add the product that this button is. Remember, we're repeating this. So when this is called, it's going to be whatever product that button is on. We don't need to do anything special about storing the ID and looking it up in a collection or any of that stuff. We're allowing ourselves to really write the code that actually deals with the object through that data binding. And that's a pretty powerful idea. If we go back and refresh our page, and I'm going to make this a little smaller so it fits on the page, every time I click buy on one of these, that count's going to go up. And so remember what's happening here. Shop is binding to the store. And then when I click on this, the store is being called to add the item. And then that change is then being reflected in this completely different component over here. And so it ends up having the store as this central state that it can share. And that way you can write services that are sort of at the center of different parts of your application. This is a good start, but let's make the cart actually work. Let's do that next. So let's build the actual cart. Back in Visual Studio, let's open up that cart design because we have this count, which we'll leave here, but we also might want to show the actual cart content. So what are we going to do? I'm going to create a simple table to store those pieces of information. And so let's create the header, row, th, and what are we going to want to show there? We're going to create a number of these. Let's say 5 of them. A small space, but we should be able to show what we want here. And so we're going to have the product, quantity, price, and total, right? And let's go ahead and create our T body. And we're going to want 5 of these as well, right? I'll come back to that first column because we're going to show a thumbnail. But for now, let's just start with product. And what we're going to want to do is create a row here, just like we did in the other one, for our items in the collection. So what is this going to be for? This is going to be let item of store.order.items, right? We're going to show the collection of items here as one row each. So this will be item product category. Let's copy this 3 more times so we can just make this a little quick. And then our quantity is just going to be, unsurprisingly, quantity. This is going to be unit price. And then for this, we're going to say unit price times item dot quantity. And let's go ahead and add some classes to the table so we can make it nice and small. We're going to use Bootstrap for that. So we'll say table, table, condensed, table, striped. This will give us a nice small table that we can see these different products in. With this in place, we come back here, we can see our little table. And as we buy items, they're going to show up in here. We have a couple of problems. One, I'd like to show a thumbnail here. And 2, we're getting repeat products. So let's fix those one at a time. For our thumbnail, let's go ahead and create an image. And for source, we're going to use that binding again. We're going to say /images item.art ID. That's actually going to be product art ID because, again, this is the order item .jpg. Let's go ahead and put something in our alt just so it has a thumbnail over it, just so we're doing the right thing. Item.product artist, let's say. And here we're going to want to add some classes. So we're going to say image fluid, and we'll create a new one called product thumb that we'll define in a minute. And before we finish this up, just make sure that you call this img. I noticed that I typed it wrong, but this needs to be an image. And we go back to our cart. Let's go ahead and add a cart view.component.css. And let's go ahead and create that here in our views. And here we'll create our product thumbnail. And all we want to really do is say max height equals 50 pixels. And if we specify max width here, go ahead and refresh this. As we buy them, we'll get the different thumbnails shown here. We still have the problem of duplication. So let's go back to the store. And instead of creating a new item every time, actually just rename this to item so that we can actually figure out what item is. So let's go ahead and say const item as an order item. And we're going to assign it by saying this.order.items.find. And here we're just going to give it an arrow function to see if we can match it. So order.product.art_ID. If that equals our product.art_ID, so it's the same item, then we're going to return it here. And now that it's something we can assign, we're going to need to go ahead and say let, which is fine. And we can go ahead and just say if item, so if it was found, we're going to do something. And if it wasn't found, we're going to go ahead and add it to our object, right? So if it wasn't found, we're going to do what we have done the whole time. If it was found, we're going to say item.quantity add 1. All right, we could make this better later by doing some other things, but for now, this should be good enough. By looking for the item, if it was found, updating the quantity every time it was clicked, we should get the experience we want. And let's just make sure that we're only adding the items to the collection when it's a new object. Because obviously taking this new item and repeatedly putting it in the product would not work. If we've done this correct, we should see that as we click buy, as that quantity goes up, we're getting different totals. Of course, we're starting to get some crazy numbers here. So last thing we want to do is in the view, let's go ahead and take our unit price and make it a currency. And let's go ahead and add that for currency as well. And as we add to it, we can see the numbers are now being formatted as a currency, and we should be all good. Now that we have the cart somewhat working, let's go ahead and add some calculated fields as well. Let's do that next. Now let's use some calculated data. Back in Visual Studio, let's go ahead and create at the bottom of this a footer, right? Table has a footer. Let's create a TR and then just one TD should be good enough, right? What we're going to want to do here is say subtotal, right? Just the total of all the items in our collection. We're going to want to do something like store.order.subtotal. Right, we're going to want some property here that we call. So in our case, we're creating a subtotal that we want to show. So let's go back over to our order, right? This class for the order. And what we really want to do is have a property, not just a field like these, but an actual property. And so I'm going to say get subtotal. And what is this going to be? This is going to be a number. And then we need to return some value, right? And so let's return 0, and we can see then we have a property that we can then use. And of course, this is an accessor, read-only accessor to subtotal to get this property every time it needs to be read. And here we're just going to use a result, and we're going to use the this.items.reduce. Now reduce is going to allow us to specify a callback to allow us to take these values. Now reduce is interesting in that the first parameter is going to be a callback. Right? Let's go ahead and just put that there. And then we're going to give it an initial value. And we're giving it an initial value on purpose because we're not really reducing the items. We're trying to have reduce return a number. And so the parameters of reduce, let's break this out into a separate line just so we can see it a little better, are going to be the total and the current value. This is going to be called for once for every item in the loop. And then we can just return from this total plus, and then we're going to do the calculation, right? Value dot unit price times value dot quantity. And so let's talk about what's happening here. We're effectively saying pass in a total and one of the items to us, and then we're going to take the total, which starts at 0, and just add in one for each item, unit price times quantity. This will calculate it for us. We're getting a little underscore there because we're not actually returning that result. And so if we take a look at how we're using this subtotal, we can see it just looks like a property here. We do need to do a call span here so that it spans all 5 of these columns up here. If we look at this, we can now see what that subtotal is. If I did this right, when I buy multiple items, we'll be able to see that total, right? And that works. But we'll notice that if I go ahead and add a t-shirt and then a mug, we're getting something wrong with the totals here, right? Let's go back and look at this. Back here in the store, we're looking for the product art ID equaling the product's art ID, right? That makes sense. But the problem is what we're looking for is that art ID, which is the individual item that we have used that product art ID multiple times. What we're actually looking for should be product ID against product ID, right? That we're actually getting that same object. Refresh now. If we buy one of each of these, they should get their own line with their own kind of product that we're dealing with. And we can see that subtotal is working. But if we buy enough of them, we can see subtotal is freaking out. And so last change, we're going to come back over to the cart. And we're going to add currency, of course, just like we did here and here. And I'm just going to add a strong around the whole thing, just so it's bolded for us. We look at it, we can now see the subtotal is doing the right thing and showing us the full subtotal. Make sense? Let's wrap up this module. What have we learned in this module? I've shown you how to create services and that they can be a method for centralizing your data and sharing data across your application. I've shown you some simple usage of the HTTP stack to interact with your API. Finally, I showed you how to do calculated data so that you can show things like summary data. Up next, we're going to take this example, we're going to add routing to show multiple pages in our application.